Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
In the hospital morgue, there was an eerie silence. The cold of death permeated through the walls. Alejandro slowly walked down the corridor, still not realizing this wasn't a dream and that all of this was happening to him. At the office of the pathologist, he was greeted by an investigator, a psychologist, and a forensic expert. Senor Gutierrez, hello. Please forgive us for having to talk to you under such a sorrowful circumstance. Identification is necessary. Alejandro, not listening to anyone, quickly entered the room where his wife Natalia's body had been brought. Sometime later, he emerged as a completely different person. With an unsteady gait, like a drunkard, he made his way to the exit and, lowering himself onto the snow-covered asphalt, howled like a wolf who had lost his chosen one. Natalia! My God! Why? Medical students, upon hearing this inhuman mournful cry, shuddered and huddled together behind their teacher, who, as if nothing had happened, continued to dissect the body and philosophically remarked, "Get used to it, you'll see more of this in our line of work." And turning around, he looked at the frightened students. "Everyone on your feet? Well done." In the 8th group, we had to use smelling salts to wake 2 of them the day before yesterday. So, who can tell me what needs to be done in such a situation? A timid girl raised her hand, and although her eyes widened with horror, she quietly said, "Administer a sedative, place the patient under medical observation." "Acceptable," nodded the mentor, placing a separated liver in a special tray. "But what if the patient resists?" In such cases, if the patient's condition threatens their own life and the lives and health of others, compulsory hospitalization is necessary. "That's right, this girl is not bad, something could be made of her," the doctor said approvingly, addressing his trembling audience. "So, let's proceed with the examination of the internal organs of our patient." They dealt with Alejandro exactly as the diligent student had advised. After he had rushed from the hospital courtyard, waving a piece of rebar to find and kill the taxi driver responsible for his pregnant wife's death, medics, working in pairs, wrestled him to the ground and injected a powerful sedative. He woke up only the next day in the intensive care unit of the city's psychiatric clinic. "Well, how are you, my friend?" The attentive eyes, greatly magnified by powerful lenses, stared directly into his bloodied soul. Alejandro mumbled something incoherent. "Another 10 milliliters, and let the infusion continue until 3 p.m., let's say." Having given instructions to the nurse, the doctor left. This went on for several days: injections, IVs, the white ceiling of the hospital room, the blurry colored spot of the window. By the end of the treatment for the severe blow that shattered Alejandro's world and himself into numerous sharp fragments, only a deep, bleeding wound remained. It hurt so much that breathing was difficult, but he no longer posed a threat to other people, those who, in some unknown way, continued to behave exactly as they always had, talking, laughing, eating, drinking, walking, and breathing, without even suspecting that one moment, one wrong move, could destroy everything they had, forever. A few days later, Alejandro submitted a letter of resignation to his workplace. The director, who highly valued the experienced and efficient employee, expressed his condolences and told him that he was free to do as he pleased, but that this decision should be made with a clear head. He granted an unscheduled paid leave, even though Alejandro had taken his annual leave just 3 months ago, in August, when he had taken his pregnant wife to the seaside. When he thought back to their happy past, the wound that had not yet fully healed began to bleed so heavily that Alejandro rushed out of the house in a panic, anywhere to avoid seeing these walls where they had been happy not too long ago. He didn't turn to alcoholism because he hardly drank at all, only a little on holidays, but he practically didn't eat and had lost 15 kilograms in just under a month. His phone remained unplugged, lying in a drawer in the hallway cabinet with other unimportant items. Alejandro often wandered aimlessly through the streets. The world was shrouded in a haze of fine snow dust. From a distance, the houses, cars, and people seemed like barely distinguishable silhouettes drifting in the dense white haze. The pale, dim blanket that covered the sky did not let a single ray of sunshine through. It's a good time to stick head in a noose. A wild and piercing thought suddenly visited Alejandro, and despite its monstrous nature, it seemed appropriate and even tempting. He immediately felt somewhat calmer as soon as he realized that if he wanted to, he could end all of this at any moment, send the ephemeral remains of his meaningless existence to hell, and enter another world, immerse himself in eternal rest, and meet his beloved Natalia and their unborn daughter there, beyond the invisible boundary. Yes, that would be wonderful. And only one tiny but persistent thought itched at him, not allowing him to fully embrace these blissful plans. What if it's not true? What if there's no peace for me even there? Raised by a strict and devout grandmother, Alejandro, who had lost his parents at an early age, had absorbed the religious beliefs imposed on him about heaven and hell, about how an upright Christian should behave, and about the fate awaiting suicides who dared to stray from the God-ordained path. But what's the point? Alejandro agonized, wandering aimlessly through busy streets, winding alleys, past city squares filled with sleeping trees and fallen leaves. We, like blind kittens, crawl and flutter about, not knowing or understanding what awaits us. And so, slowly ambling and tormented, Alejandro found himself by the river. He hardly paid attention to his surroundings or knew where he was. He descended to the water and walked onto an old pedestrian bridge connecting the upper part of the city and the lower part, known as the creek in the local parlance. The creek was mainly populated by small private houses that had once made up the entire city before the war. The bridge was narrow and practically deserted, with only a few passers-by hurrying to shorten their route, emerging from the thickening twilight, and a kind-hearted old lady was tossing bread to the ducks, leaning on the rickety railing. Alejandro hardly noticed anything. He just kept walking and walking, wherever his eyes took him, without thinking about his destination or the end point of his journey. Near the end of the last span, something disturbed him, as if an intruder were persistently knocking on the firmly closed doors of his thoughts. Alejandro winced in annoyance, shrugged, and glanced around. Blinking, he attempted to shift his focus on the reality, trying to pinpoint the source of the annoying noise. After a couple of minutes, standing and listening, he realized the irritating sound was coming from the bank, somewhere very close. He descended from the bridge to the water's edge and among the dry reeds, saw some movement, about a meter from the edge of the semi-rotted footbridges used by fishermen in the warmer months. The sound would stop and then start again, tormenting Alejandro's battered psyche. Approaching a bit more, he finally spotted the source, some small creature struggling in the icy water near the bank, attempting to climb onto solid ground. Desperate attempts were accompanied by sharp, crying screams. That's how those enduring hardships cry out in hopes of rescue. This poor soul was lucky, salvation had arrived. Alejandro, with one foot in a high boot, stepped into the water, reached out, and pulled the wet whimpering puppy by the scruff. Having made it up the slope, he placed the pup on the snow-covered grass, still green, recently trimmed by city services, and examined it closely. The puppy was very small, barely over a month old, with its eyes barely open, glued shut from the cold and tears. Its fur, indistinctly dark in color, was matted with stiff icicles, and its thin tail trembled. Actually, its whole body quivered like an aspen leaf, crying desperately and trying to crawl somewhere, instinctively seeking warmth and dry shelter. Alejandro, after gazing at his unexpected find for a moment, awkwardly wiped it with his scarf, tucked it into his coat, and turned back towards home. However, on the way, he changed his mind and, taking a detour relative to the shortest route, found himself near a veterinary clinic, a familiar place from happier times when he and Natalia brought a little parrot here a few years ago, sick with some avian disease. The small reception area was nearly empty, with only one visitor sitting there with a cat carrier, waiting for their turn. She passed the time by looking at something on her smartphone, occasionally tapping invisible buttons. "Are you the last one?" Alejandro asked, even though it was obvious. Yes, the woman nodded without taking her eyes off the small screen. Soon, she was called, and Alejandro was left alone, or not quite alone. The foundling, who had whimpered for the first few minutes, had now warmed up and fallen asleep. Carefully opening his coat, the man noticed that the little one, pressed against his warm body, was peacefully snoring with the tip of its pink tongue poking out. "Come in." The door to the vet's office opened, letting out the woman with the cat. Alejandro, with the puppy tucked inside his coat, entered. "I found it in the water," he said to the vet as he carefully took out his living discovery. Let's see. Who do we have here?" The eyes are barely open. Hypothermia, dehydration, of course, but overall, the vet murmured as she examined the puppy, turning and feeling it. The puppy, protesting and not understanding why its warm and cozy place suddenly disappeared, whimpered while sitting on the lookout table. "So, look," said the doctor after the examination, "it's not all that bad. He's weakened and dehydrated, of course, but he hasn't reached a critical state yet. You need to give him these drops. I'll write you a prescription. Warm drinks, good food, rinse his eyes, and everything should get back to normal. You, little chunk," the doctor informed the puppy, clearing his eyes. The little one, finally getting the chance to see the world around him, tilted his head, looked at the people, and unexpectedly let out a high-pitched yip, with a funny growl at the end. The doctor and Alejandro smiled. A protector in the making, the doctor approved of the puppy. "What breed is he?" Alejandro asked, not expecting it himself. Why did he care about this puppy? Initially, when he came here, he intended to leave him at the clinic to be taken care of or placed in a shelter. But when he saw how trustingly this little one snuggled up to him, something stirred inside. "I'm not an expert, of course," the doctor said cautiously, "but judging by the size and body structure, it's possible he's a mixed breed of a large wolf-like dog, like a shepherd or husky, for example." "So, he'll grow quite big?" Alejandro clarified. "Yes, undoubtedly," the doctor replied, "and strong. Look at those thick paws, it's a sign of a sturdy build. By the way, what do you plan to do with him?" "I don't know," Alejandro admitted. "I didn't intend to get a dog, especially a big one. Then leave him here. We collaborate with a shelter, volunteers will pick him up. Perhaps, for now, I'll take him with me," Alejandro suddenly decided, "and we'll see from there." "Okay, then come for a checkup in a week or two. At this age, they grow very quickly, and we'll need to examine him again. And if there's an emergency clinic not far from here. Here's the address." The doctor handed him a business card. "Thank you." Alejandro put his little foundling back into his coat, and they left the clinic. Finally home, Alejandro first took the puppy to the bathroom, filled a basin with warm water, and thoroughly cleaned him with a sponge, wiping him dry with a towel. Once dry, the little one became plush, light gray with a darker stripe along his back, a dark face, ears, and pale spots above his eyebrows, on the tips of his paws, on his chest, and under his tail. "Huh, you're pretty handsome as I see," Alejandro said, smiling. The puppy wagged his thin tail, coiled it into a little circle, and, with a comical stride, hopped closer, settling by Alejandro's leg. He raised his head and yipped again, this time without any growling. "Well, hello there." Alejandro picked him up, and the puppy, reaching out to his face, quickly licked his cheek with his warm and soft tongue. "Oh, you silly one," he petted the little guy. "You must be hungry," Alejandro suddenly realized. He went to the kitchen, poured some milk for the puppy, and the little one eagerly and quickly lapped up every last drop. Late in the evening, with the foundling pup snuggled up on the carpet at Alejandro's feet, peacefully snoozing, his plump belly exposed, the sole inhabitant of the empty house sat in a thoughtful contemplation in his armchair, gazing out into the darkened windows. There was minimal lighting in the apartment, except for a small hallway lamp. The curtains were open, allowing an unobstructed view of the quieting city. "I found a puppy today. I almost thought about ending it all, but he wouldn't let me. Forgive me, Natalia. We'll be together again when the time comes," Alejandro thought sadly. These nightly conversations with his deceased wife were now his only solace, along with this four-legged little one, saved from certain doom. As if hearing his melancholic human thoughts, the puppy whimpered in his sleep and twitched his paws. "Still putting up a fight, little warrior?" Alejandro said to him and, leaning over, gently stroked his tummy. The puppy calmed down and fell silent. They sat like this almost until dawn, and Alejandro didn't go to bed. He hadn't slept in the bedroom for a long time, where not too long ago it had been warm and cozy with his wife. He slept on the couch in the living room, and sometimes, like tonight, in the armchair. Early in the morning, the puppy woke up and, whimpering, started wandering around the room. Alejandro, too, woke up from a brief restless sleep, and upon seeing the puppy's distress, picked him up, put on his coat, and stepped out into the frosty November air. He placed the little one on the grass by the entrance, and the puppy immediately relieved himself. "Good job," Alejandro praised him and started walking ahead. The puppy followed along, sometimes whimpering if the human walked too fast. They walked for about half an hour before Alejandro decided that it was enough for such a little guy and turned back home. Returning inside, he fed his new pet, had some coffee himself, and then lay down on the couch. For the first time since the terrible tragedy, he slept a deep and relatively peaceful sleep. He woke up when the pale autumn sun was already high in the hazy sky, peeking through breaks in the drifting cottony clouds. He lowered his legs from the couch, and his heel was immediately licked. "Wow, are you going to wash my socks now?" Alejandro laughed. "Well, let's go have lunch." As it turned out, it was almost dinner time by the clock, and both of them enjoyed a meal of scrambled eggs with canned meat and had their choice of either coffee or water. From that day on, their life rhythm was set: eat, and then you can sleep, sleep, and then you can eat. Of course, Alejandro still missed his deceased wife, but at least thoughts of suicide no longer plagued him. He felt responsible for the life of another living being, one who depended entirely on him. The days passed, and the puppy grew before Alejandro's eyes. In almost a year, the small, clumsy pup transformed into a long-legged, well-built canine adolescent. He had small, erect ears like a husky's, a slender, slightly fluffy tail, jauntily curved upwards like a saber, and observant dark eyes. Soon, Alejandro realized that his tail-wagging friend was incredibly smart. An opportunity to understand this came during a walk. In the morning, as they were running, the dog got distracted. Alejandro heard him barking and rustling in the distance in the bushes. He tried to call out, no response. He approached, intending to express his disapproval for such improper canine behavior when he saw a human leg sticking out from under the bush. Alejandro whistled with concern and, leaning over the person lying there, felt a faint pulse. There was a weak, trembling beat. The dog was circling nearby, whining anxiously. The person under the bush was incredibly heavy, and it proved extremely challenging to move him higher. Moreover, the thought occurred to Alejandro, moving an injured person without knowing what's wrong with them is not a good idea. "Sit here," he said to the dog, "guard, and wait for me. I'll be back soon." And he left to find help. Anyone familiar with raising puppies would understand how difficult it is for an untrained young dog to understand what's required of them. However, this dog understood and did as his owner commanded. Alejandro himself couldn't explain why he had acted this way, leaving the dog with the injured man. But it turned out to be the absolutely right decision. Climbing up the slope, Alejandro asked the first passerby to call the police and an ambulance, explaining the situation. He hadn't taken his phone out of the drawer. Then he encountered a pair of patrolling police officers in the park. "Please come with me," he said to them. "There's a man down in the bushes, unconscious." As they approached the scene, they heard loud and angry growling and muffled shouts. When they got closer, they saw quite a spectacle. Two dubious-looking individuals were circling around the unconscious man, and the dog, bristling and baring his teeth, was defending the fallen person. Seeing Alejandro, the dog barked joyfully and intensified his retaliatory attacks. When the police arrived, the individuals fled downhill toward the river. One of the police officers chased after them, shouting at Alejandro, "Set your dog on them." The other officer knelt beside the man lying in the bushes. Alejandro commanded his shaggy friend, "Go get them." And the dog, as if waiting for that signal, shot off like an arrow in pursuit of the fleeing criminals. In about 10 minutes, it was all over. Medical assistants arrived for the injured man, and he was taken to the hospital. Alejandro and his four-legged friend were invited to the police station to provide witness statements. "What a handsome boy! Well done!" exclaimed the law enforcement officers, praising the dog as his owner filled out the necessary paperwork. "He's really something. It's as if he's been professionally trained. You should consider joining the police force with him," one of them said. "I didn't specifically train him," Alejandro admitted a bit shyly. "He seems to understand everything on his own." "In that case, you've stumbled upon a real treasure. What is his name?" Alejandro felt even more embarrassed. "You know, I never planned to have a dog. I found him, small and helpless, in cold water, struggling to get on the bank. I haven't chosen his name yet." "My, oh my," the police officer exclaimed in even greater amazement. "But this won't do, we need to give him a name. He's a real fighter, you can tell right away." "You're right, the fighter," agreed Alejandro. "I knew it as soon as I found him. He struggled and screamed to survive, resisted till the end." "Let's call him Fighter then," the policeman decided. "So we'll record it in the protocol for you," he addressed the dog. Citizen Senor Alejandro Gutierrez, with a dog of an unknown breed by the name of Fighter, assisted in apprehending 2 pickpocket thieves. "Do you already know who they are?" Alejandro asked. "Yes," the police officer nodded. "We've known their identities for a while, but catching them in the act has proven difficult, those quick rascals. But now your Fighter has helped us." "Good boy, smart one," he said to the dog again. The newly named dog politely thumped his tail in response. "Thank you very much, we won't detain you any longer," the policeman finally said. "If you ever decide to put this wagging tail to service, feel free to join us. We'd be happy to have such dogs in our K9 unit." "Goodbye," Alejandro bid farewell, and he and Fighter walked out onto the street. The next day, Alejandro returned to his previous job. His work involved a lot of traveling around the city and the region, overseeing couriers and warehouse workers. He decided to take Fighter with him. The smart dog quickly adapted to his new lifestyle. After breakfast and a walk, he would go out to the yard with his owner, jump into the front seat next to the drivers, and spend the entire day accompanying Alejandro. When Alejandro was busy, Fighter didn't interfere or whine. He stayed nearby, patiently waiting for his owner to finish. Sometimes, he would briefly wander off for his canine business, but always stayed within earshot. A simple whistle from Alejandro, and loyal Fighter would dash back to the car. Running up, he would wag his tail joyfully and look into his owner's eyes. "Hello, boss, I'm here, I'm right here, waiting for you, you're finally back." A few days later, Alejandro received a call from the police station during his lunch break. "Good day, the victim, whom you and Fighter found in the park, would like to see you. He's being discharged from the hospital today and asked us to find you." The next day, during their lunch break, the friends arrived at the clinic. Through the tall glass windows of the waiting room, Alejandro spotted a tall elderly man sitting in the lobby. "Sit, Fighter," he commanded the dog. "Wait for me here. I'll be back soon." The dog patiently waited. His owner entered through the white door and then appeared on the other side behind the transparent, solid partition. Fighter knew it allowed him to see but not pass through. Behind the partition, his owner and another person, whose scent Fighter couldn't detect from here, shook hands and spoke, just like people do. Then the white door opened again and released his owner, but also the other person. Now Fighter recognized his scent. It was the same person who needed help in the park. "And here you are, my protector," addressing Fighter, old man said. "Thank you, my friend." And, leaning down, he patted him between the ears. Fighter endured the excessive familiarity with dignity because his owner didn't mind, and he even politely wagged his tail. Then the man left, and they also departed. In the evening, Alejandro poured himself some coffee and also prepared a cup for Fighter, who had picked up some human habits during this time, like drinking coffee with milk. He told his shaggy friend about things he hadn't heard, being on the other side of the transparent barrier. You know, Fighter, it turns out he's a wealthy man. Plus, he's not in the best health, his heart is acting up. It's unclear why he decided to run alone in the lower park. If it weren't for you, he might never have run again. Yes, you're a good boy, Fighter. A good boy. Well, that's that. So, our saved man wasn't feeling well, stumbled, rolled down the hill, and fell into the bushes. The hospital diagnosed a heart attack. You found him in the nick of time. And now they've invited us to work for him as security. Me as the head and you as my assistant. That's the situation, Fighter. They promised to pay a lot. I'm not sure if we need it, though. Let's think about it, okay? The dog, who had been attentively watching Alejandro during this mostly one-sided conversation, flattened his ears and barked softly. That's what I'm saying, let's sleep on it, the owner agreed. Meanwhile, spring had firmly established itself. Young April had melted almost all the snow, cleared the gloomy sky, and painted it with a bright, joyful shade of azure. But for Alejandro, this change brought back the dull ache that hadn't gone away yet. It was time to put a permanent monument on his late wife's grave, replacing the simple wooden cross. One day during the week, he and Fighter drove to the appropriate workshop, where Alejandro ordered a morning monument. That evening, he finally took out and turned on his phone, which he hadn't touched since the tragedy. 3 new messages immediately popped up. Alejandro, taking a deep breath, tapped on the pop-up window. 3 messages from Natalia, expressing her love and the desire to order 2 large pizzas for the evening, along with a request to buy some peaches. She really loved peaches, especially when she was pregnant. She was. A heavy lump formed in his throat, and treacherous shivers ran down his spine. Without looking at the screen any longer, Alejandro decisively erased the entire message history and deleted the conversation. Then, he lay down on the couch, facing the wall, and fell silent. His faithful Fighter, who had been sitting quietly on the side all this time, silently crept closer, sniffed the smartphone lying on the table near the couch, let out a faint whine, feeling that it had upset his owner, and nestled his smart muzzle on Alejandro's shoulder. After some time, the owner turned around, stroked Fighter's head, and the dog gently licked Alejandro's tear-moistened face, whimpering softly. It's okay, Fighter, it's okay, the owner said, petting him. Everything's fine. But the next day at work, an unpleasant surprise awaited him. They sent all the employees home. What, Alejandro? You don't follow the news? His co-workers were surprised. They declared quarantine. There's a global epidemic, a virus. I don't keep up with it, Alejandro agreed. What's there to look at? And for a whole month, they stayed indoors with Fighter, only going out when absolutely necessary, and even then, not closer than 100 meters from home. These were the harsh new rules, and it turned out that dog owners unexpectedly found themselves in a more advantageous position. People without dogs were only allowed to go out to the store or the pharmacy. And everyone, absolutely everyone except dogs, had to wear protective masks. But Fighter didn't like this situation at all. Accustomed to freedom, he followed Alejandro with his tail, whimpering and looking into his eyes, as if asking what was happening and why they were cooped up. It's a pandemic, buddy, his owner explained. A virus, damn it. It's awful what's going on. During this month of isolation, Alejandro considered accepting Don Marquez's offer, the unlucky runner they had unintentionally saved. He felt sorry for Fighter, who was forced to spend whole days in a stuffy apartment. At their new job, they were promised a separate house on a huge controlled territory. Since going to work was unnecessary now, they only needed to remotely oversee the warehouses. Alejandro contacted the potential employer, obtained all the necessary permits to travel by car somewhere other than the pharmacy or hospital, and, with an ecstatic Fighter in tow, set off on the designated route. The owner of the vast estate greeted them in person. Clad in a protective suit and helmet-like mask, he looked more like an alien than an ordinary person. What times we live in, Alejandro thought. Good day, Don Marquez, he said as they shook hands, and the man smiled joyfully while speaking through the mask, which made his words sound muffled, like a bad phone connection. I hope you'll like it here. Suddenly, a deafening barking erupted, and a large, snow-white dog appeared on the lawn in front of the big house, growling menacingly at the strangers. Fighter flattened his ears and assumed a waiting position. The fur on the back of his neck bristled, and his tail stood upright. However, when the approaching dog got almost nose-to-nose with him, he changed his stance, grinned, and wagged his tail, displaying complete loyalty. What's this? Don Marquez chuckled. Didn't expect this, did you? And you, naughty girl, why did you jump over the fence again? Huh? I'm talking to you. The beautiful white dog tucked her fluffy tail, crouched low, and wriggling her whole body, crawled toward her owner, apologizing for her actions. The security guard ran after her. I'm sorry, for heaven's sake, Don Marquez. I didn't watch her closely enough. We really should tie her up, she jumps like a swallow. No need to tie her up, the owner cut in. No need to torment a living being. Let her roam like that. Look, now she's found a friend. It'll be more fun for them together. Come, my dear saviors, I'll show you everything. And he beckoned Alejandro and Fighter to follow him along the path that ran alongside the high fence. Here we have greenhouses, and there's the conservatory. I mostly work there. And these are your apartments if you'd like. I'll leave you to explore, and then we can chat. The house they were offered to stay in was quite small, but it was more than enough for the friends. A small square hallway on one side, a door to a small combined bathroom on the other, a kitchen, and a living room of about 16 square meters. It was designed like a studio, with all the necessary amenities and beautiful finishes, including a wooden staircase leading upstairs. There was an attic with a bedroom and a shower. What more could they need? And most importantly, they could roam as much as they pleased. That was their job, to guard this designated territory. Fighter would excel in this role. Alejandro was completely confident in him, and he was prepared to do his part as well. We agree, he said to Benjamin Marquez after half an hour, sitting at a low table in the glass greenhouse and watching Fighter and Belle, the name of the host's white dog, playing in the yard. Excellent, Benjamin nodded. I'm very pleased. My security will now be under your command. Unfortunately, my previous head of security, a longtime friend, recently passed away. Benjamin wiped away a tear and turned to watch the playing dogs. And my Belle, he chuckled, looking back at Alejandro. That's what I call her. My wife named her Isabella, meaning beauty. She's a purebred Swiss shepherd, but she's a terrible guard dog, all she's good at is barking. Benjamin smiled. So, do we have a deal? Yes, Alejandro said. But I'd prefer not to quit my current job just yet. Who knows what the future holds? This remote work doesn't take up much of my time. Of course, Benjamin agreed. That's quite reasonable. The most important thing is that you and Fighter are here, on site. Don Marquez had reason to be cautious. He was a well-known figure in scientific circles. Don Benjamin Marquez, a world-renowned biologist, was conducting research that could revolutionize the field. His country house, surrounded by a vast plot of land, had been targeted for robbery twice, and many suspected that the burglars were after his scientific findings. On the day they found him in the park, Alejandro and Fighter, he told the police that he was out for a run. That wasn't the truth. He was meeting a colleague who had offered to help him with a complex issue. But in the middle of their engaging conversation, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his forearm, and he remembered nothing else. Later, in the clinic, he pieced it all together and realized that someone had tried to eliminate him by mimicking a heart attack. Fortunately, the dosage had been too small. Moreover, he was quickly found by those two, the man and the dog. He survived, and he had no intention of leaving his mansion now, especially since the circumstances made it necessary and desirable. Under the watchful protection of the brilliant, intelligent dog and his trained and highly resourceful owner, Benjamin felt secure. Furthermore, this man, Alejandro, was far from Benjamin's usual circle. A former trooper and now an expediter, he didn't raise any suspicions. Reliable people had thoroughly and comprehensively vetted him. Soon the friends moved to a new place of work and residence with all the necessary belongings. 2 bags and a small suitcase, that's all the packing. Alejandro unpacked the things, settled in a bit, and got acquainted with the 4 guards who were now under his command. They didn't permanently reside on the premises, they switched shifts every 2 days. They were all good guys who knew their job. But Fighter was happy with the change of scenery, like a little puppy. First of all, he walked around and sniffed the entire vast and secure territory. The estate covered a full 2 hectares of wooded land, and the owners had left most of it untouched. The forest trees were still standing, and the berries and mushrooms hadn't gone anywhere. Such a magnificent property had been allocated to Benjamin a long time ago, in recognition of his services to the country and as a site for necessary research. Alejandro wasn't explained the nature of his scientific research, and he didn't particularly need to know. Their job was to protect it, and they did it diligently. 2 of the guards mainly stood watch at the gates and in the utility part of the estate. Alejandro, on the other hand, with Fighter, made several rounds around the entire extensive territory several times a day and, returning to the starting point, checked how things were at the main post. The first round was very early, just as the sun was rising. The last one was well past midnight. Alejandro didn't find such a schedule burdensome at all. He always slept little and very lightly. If necessary, he could take a short nap during the day, and that would suffice. Fighter, like all guard dogs, was ready to work round the clock, resting in between shifts, which suited him just fine. As for their food, they didn't have to worry about it. Everyone was fed centrally. The owners had a personal chef and kitchen staff who prepared meals for everyone, including the other staff. You could have breakfast, lunch, and dinner in a small communal dining room on the ground floor of the utility building connected to the main house by a covered gallery. Alternatively, you could take your food to go. Alejandro often chose the latter option. "He misses me," he explained to his colleagues. "He's gotten used to it. Should I really drag his bowl here?" And that was the absolute truth. The loyal dog never touched his food until his boss appeared. The dogs were fed in the yard under a large canopy. While waiting for his owner, Fighter sat next to his full bowl, his gaze fixed on the door, patiently waiting. Belle, on the other hand, often finished her portion quickly and checked whether her new companion was being served better. Fighter, a true gentleman, didn't object if the lady wanted to confirm something and only silently watched as his legitimate meal disappeared into Belle's charming jaws. "All right, my night," Alejandro laughed as he stepped out into the yard. "Let's go, I've got something special for you." So they lived a peaceful and free life, isolated from the outside world. One morning, while patrolling the territory, Fighter once again proved that he didn't eat his rations in vain. In the lush young grass, dewdrops glistened like diamonds, early rising birds sang, and the wonderful scent of pine mixed with the cool breath of the morning earth. When the friends went on their first daily patrol, the fence around the land was not solid but made of wire mesh stretched between stone pillars. The owners liked it that way, and, as Don Marquez put it, he didn't want to live as if in prison. At one point, Fighter lagged behind a bit, sniffing something under a large spreading oak tree, and Alejandro, walking slowly along the path along the fence, suddenly saw a homeless-looking fellow who had settled down to do his business near the fence. Before he could say a word, Fighter, who had darted like a gray lightning bolt, jumped over the fence and, landing right next to the man, without a word, grabbed him from behind and pulled his sagging pants down even further with a growl. The tipsy man, hardly having time to realize and notice what had happened, literally jumped out of his pants in fear and, as naked as he was, rushed away into the forest, screaming in terror. Fighter, immediately jumping back, proudly laid at his owner's feet his military trophy. Alejandro bent in half with laughter, and the smart dog, who could keenly sense human emotions, even felt a little offended. What? Won't they praise me for honest service? The boss just laughs at me. He sat down next to the homeless man's pants and, squinting in a contemptuous grimace, turned his snout away from the owner. That's when Alejandro, controlling himself, said seriously to him, trying not to laugh out loud. Well done, fighter, but you need to take those pants back. Honestly, take them and carry. And all the way back, the dog proudly marched with the pants in his mouth, and the comrades in arms laughed for a long time, hearing from Alejandro this humorous story, and praised Fighter, one after another. Oh, you gray little wolf, don't mess with someone like that, guys, y'all hear? Don Marquez also laughed when he learned about the morning incident and used Fighter as an example to Belle. This is a smart dog who knows who's good or bad, and you, fool, bark at everyone and wag your fluffy tail at everyone. And the lovely Belle just smiled at her owner, showing all her dazzling pearl-white teeth. In this way, without noticing it themselves, the friends spent most of the spring, summer, and almost all of autumn in their new place. November had come again, the month in which Natalia's life tragically ended. On this sad anniversary, he was gloomy and uncommunicative, didn't come for meals, and answered his comrades' questions with monosyllables, blaming it on a headache. Poor Fighter, sensing his owner's mood, followed him like a careful shadow, occasionally nudging his wet nose into his palm. In the middle of the day, Alejandro couldn't bear it, excused himself from Benjamin, and went to the cemetery, leaving Fighter on guard, instructing him to wait for him and protect. He stood for a long time at the fence near the newly erected monument, talking to Natalia, as was his habit, and to their unborn daughter. Well, hello, my dear. How are you all? Fighter and I are doing fine. We now live in the countryside. He enjoys the beauty and space here, but for me, it doesn't matter where I am without you. Alejandro sighed heavily. We have a pandemic here. Things are bad. Hospitals are a nightmare. People are brought in by hundreds and thousands. Sports complexes are converted into hospitals. I've rented out our apartment for now. Nice people have moved in, tiny ones, so don't worry, Natalia. And he talked to his wife for some time, sharing the latest news. When he returned to his post, Alejandro found an ambulance car in the yard. It turned out that Benjamin's wife was being taken to the clinic. The insidious virus had made its way here. During the commotion, Alejandro took Fighter into his house, which was unusual, but the dog seemed restless, peeking out the window, until the owner scolded him. So the offended dog lay down by the door, nervously twitching, listening to the sounds coming from the street. When the ambulance left, Alejandro released him. It was time for dinner, and contrary to his usual behavior, the dog darted to the door leading to the dining room. Alejandro was amazed. He entered to pick up his food as usual, and Fighter, nearly knocking him over, slipped between his legs and rushed with a growl towards the glass door inside the room, leading further into the gallery. It was then that Alejandro realized something was amiss and decided to let the dog show him what was wrong. He opened the door for Fighter and followed him. The dog, pleased that he was understood, lowered his nose to the floor and went with a subdued growl, sniffing along the gallery. He's picked up a scent, Alejandro guessed. Following the dog, he opened the necessary doors, walked through corridors and rooms, climbed stairs, and finally arrived at a large, massive wooden door with a small window at the top. The door was located on the top floor of the mansion. Alejandro had never been here before, and as he followed Fighter, he didn't encounter a single soul. The dog, reaching this point, sat at the threshold, raised his hackles, and continued growling, not stopping. Alejandro touched the door handle. It was locked, but something was definitely wrong, and he had no doubt about it. Stay here, he ordered his shaggy friend. Guard it, I'll be back soon. He didn't need to explain twice. Fighter had no intention of leaving this place. Alejandro went down to the floor below and saw a woman in work clothes walking down the corridor. Excuse me, Please, he called out to her. Ask my guys downstairs to come up and find the key to the door with a window on the top floor. I don't have a phone, and I can't leave a dog alone for long, Alejandro explained to her. It's the owner's office, the cleaner was surprised. No one is allowed in there, and the key is only with him. It doesn't matter, Alejandro insisted, just call the security guards. All right, the cleaner nodded and went down the stairs. As soon as she disappeared from view, one of the doors on the second floor swung open, and Don Marquez himself appeared on the landing in his home attire, with a robe thrown over it. He looked sad. Alejandro, he exclaimed, what are you doing here? Fighter led me upstairs, the young man explained. He was so eager to get inside and worried, so I decided to personally check what's going on. Now he's sitting by your office door and growling. Let's go see what's there, Benjamin worried. No, Alejandro protested, you shouldn't go there, it's too dangerous. Give me the key. The guys will be here soon, and we'll assess the situation. All right, Benjamin reluctantly agreed, returned to the room, and brought a bunch of keys. This one, he pointed to Alejandro, but I request that you take personal responsibility, there are valuable documents in there. Of course, Alejandro nodded. Don't worry. Footsteps on the stairs were heard, and Hugo, one of the guys from the street post, appeared. You called for me? He inquired. Mateo stayed downstairs. That's right, Alejandro approved. Come on, we need to check the office. The two of them went back up 2 flights of stairs and found Fighter still in the same alert posture, sitting by the door. When he saw his owner, he wagged his tail a couple of times and then lowered his muzzle back under the door, sniffing something and growling threateningly. All right, Alejandro whispered. I'm going to open the door, I'll go in, and you stay outside to guard the exit. Understand? Hugo nodded in agreement. Alejandro inserted the key into the lock and turned it 1 full turn. The lock creaked quietly, and the door swung open. A flimsy lock, Alejandro thought, but Fighter had already burst inside, sticking his snout through the gap in the door. Inside the large room, without hesitation, he rushed to tear down the curtain, leaping around frantically. A shot rang out from behind the curtain, and the dog, yelping, collapsed on the parquet floor. Alejandro cursed himself for not bringing any weapons or a phone from the house. He had only gone for dinner. Leaping onto the swaying curtain, he shouted to Hugo. Come here. Hugo didn't lose his composure, and a few seconds later, he and Alejandro were wrestling the young man hiding behind the curtain to the ground. The police arrived fairly quickly, as did the ambulance and veterinary care. The criminal was taken away to a well-known place behind bars, while Fighter and his owner were taken to a 24-hour clinic for our smaller brothers. Fortunately, the bullet had hit the dog in the shoulder, and no vital organs were damaged. Alejandro spent almost the entire night in the veterinary clinic's waiting room, waiting for the operation to finish, and then waiting for his loyal friend to wake up from anesthesia. During this time, nearly the entire staff had expressed their admiration to him, both as a pet owner and for having such a brave dog. You've raised him so well, the female doctor told him. Coming out after the surgery, many dogs in his condition, like after car accidents, for example, behave either aggressively or go into shock and fear everything, trying to bite doctors and resisting treatment. But yours, even though he was in acute pain, managed to lick my hand while I was giving him an injection. He's like that, Alejandro agreed, smiling. Brave and kind. I named him Fighter. What a darling, the doctor exclaimed. How about a shorter nickname? A nickname? Alejandro pondered. I don't really use nicknames with him, to be honest. I know, the doctor suddenly said, raising her eyebrows. He's Fighter, so you can call him Fitch. It sounds snappier and shorter. I often call him that with the guys, Alejandro told her. He knows that too. And now go home, the doctor told him. It's time for you to rest too. What about you? Alejandro suddenly asked. Aren't you leaving? I'm on around-the-clock shift, the woman laughed. I have work to do, I'll leave in the morning. Then I'll leave in the morning too, but together with my friend, Alejandro declared, settling into a chair in the waiting room. If you don't mind, I'll take a nap here. Oh no, the doctor protested. We have a special waiting area for owners, just for such cases. Come with me, I'll show you. There are coffee machines and a water cooler there. Then I invite you for coffee, Alejandro smiled, giving her a slight bow, for saving my boy. Oh, there was nothing too serious for him, except for a lot of blood loss, the woman said, embarrassed. It was actually quite lucky, he didn't even hit any ligaments. In a couple of weeks, he'll be as good as new. Let's celebrate it with a cup of coffee, then, Alejandro smiled. Not everyone is so lucky, he suddenly turned melancholy. The woman looked at him attentively but said nothing. They reached a small room with a low sofa, 2 armchairs, a coffee table, a coffee machine, a water cooler, and a TV on the wall. They made themselves 2 cups of coffee, with Alejandro pouring and bringing them. He offered his companion to sit on the sofa and relax. Here you go. And he placed a cup of hot drink in front of her. Thank you, you're very kind, she thanked him. I'm really grateful to you, Alejandro admitted, taking a sip from his cup. Besides Fighter, I have no one else. They fell silent, enjoying the quiet and the hot coffee. Suddenly, Alejandro snapped his fingers and hit his forehead with his palm. My goodness, I didn't even ask your name. I'm sorry, it's probably the stress. I was really worried about my friend. Irene, the woman said. Irene Delgado for patients, or rather, for their owners, she laughed at her mistake, and for friends, just Irene. Thank you once again, Irene Delga, Alejandro sincerely said, then corrected himself with a smile. I mean, just Irene. I hope we'll have the chance to properly thank you in the future, me and Fitch. Oh, you've already named him Fitch, that's progress. But I must be going now, take some rest. After she left, Alejandro, sitting in the chair, took a short nap, then woke up, checked the time, and realized there was just about half an hour left until 8 in the morning. That meant he could soon pick up Fighter and go home. He went out into the corridor, then walked around the clinic, feeling hungry. He got into his car and drove to the nearest fast food joint that was open early. After eating, he also bought 2 large pizzas for the veterinary staff. Returning to the clinic, he left them at the reception desk, received their thanks, and then went to pick up his furry friend. Irene was no longer there, and another doctor, a young guy who looked more like a student, gave him Fighter's documents, discharge summary, and a list of recommendations. Now, go straight down the corridor to the inpatient area. There's a door on the right with a sign. That's where you'll find your Fighter in the first room. Fighter, seeing his owner, wagged his tail joyfully and smiled. Hello, I missed you so much. Alejandro approached him and kissed his shiny black nose. You're my hero, he told him. A good, very good dog, my dear Fitch. At home in the estate, a solemn reception awaited the 4-legged hero. The owner, Don Marquez, greeted him as a dear guest. The most delicious meaty treats were prepared especially for Fighter, along with vitamins and medicines, all to help him recover faster. If it weren't for you and your owner, my life's work would have been in vain, Benjamin said. Now I'm forever in your debt. It wasn't me at all, Alejandro said, feeling a bit embarrassed. It was all Fitch. Fitch? Benjamin raised his eyebrows at the new name for the dog. Yes, Alejandro nodded affirmatively. We decided that he deserves a cute nickname. Oh! Benjamin exclaimed, clapping his hands. He deserves everything he desires. But Fitch didn't desire anything more than to be with his beloved owner, to take walks together, guard the property, swim in the river in the summer, and frolic in the snow in the winter. Wasn't this the ultimate dream for any loyal dog, to have the person who meant the world to them always by their side? The hero dog recovered quickly. Within a few days, he stopped limping on 3 legs and confidently put weight on the injured one. A few weeks later, he was running around as if he had never been injured. The wound left by the criminal's bullet quickly healed, covered by a new coat of fur that made it almost invisible. And as for the estate owner's security team, with the exception of Alejandro and Boy, they had a thorough debriefing. "How did you let this scoundrel slip through?" Clearly, he didn't crawl through the fence, the security team was grilled. "We didn't see anyone from outside, except for the doctors and paramedics who arrived with the ambulance," the guards defended themselves. Further investigation, with the involvement of the police who interrogated the apprehended offender, revealed the following: an armed spy infiltrated the house by disguising himself as a paramedic. It turned out that he had been lurking nearby, observing the house and its daily routines, calculating how to breach the carefully guarded perimeter. Upon seeing an ambulance approach, he saw his chance, quickly made the necessary call, and his accomplices promptly delivered the required uniform. In the paramedic's attire and a mask, he slipped through the open gate in the chaos without arousing suspicion from the security or the residents. Undoubtedly, he would have achieved his goal if not for Fighter's keen nose and his owner's intuition. Irene, the veterinarian who treated Fighter during the middle of her shift, didn't expect to witness the following spectacle: a cunning canine face poked through the open office door, holding a bouquet of several chrysanthemums and roses in its teeth. Then, the four-legged benefactor squeezed through the door himself and, approaching her, carefully placed the flowers at her feet. "Fitch, my dear, where did you come from?" Irene exclaimed, surprised and delighted. "What a charming bouquet. You're a true gentleman." The dog, sitting on his hind legs, raised his front ones and performed an endearing bunny hop. "Oh, you're such a good boy," the doctor admired him. "What a sweetheart." "We came to thank you," Alejandro told her, entering the room after Boy and smiling. "Thank you very much. And this is for you too." He handed her a large box of chocolates. "You really shouldn't have," Irene blushed. "And that's not all," Alejandro said. "Boy and I would like to invite you to dinner at the dog-friendly restaurant if you don't mind." "Oh, how lovely. Can you bring dogs there?" Irene asked. "Yes, well-behaved dogs," Alejandro clarified. "I'm sure Fitch is very well-behaved," she replied. "He practically raised himself," Alejandro admitted. "I found him almost 2 years ago, pulled him out of icy water near the pedestrian bridge in the old town." "I know that place. There's a Belgian Malinois kennel nearby," Irene said thoughtfully. "I've been there a few times for calls." "What kind of dogs are Malinois?" Alejandro asked, not being particularly well-versed in dog breeds. "They are Belgian Shepherds, one of the varieties of their national breed. These dogs, quite popular nowadays, are known for their agility, intelligence, and trainability." "Fitch loves to jump," Alejandro smiled. "He can leap pretty high." It immediately struck me that he resembles a Belgian Malinois mix and possibly another large shepherd breed, Irene pondered. It's possible that 2 dogs of different breeds accidentally mated, and the kennel owner decided to get rid of the unwanted puppies. "That seems likely," Alejandro agreed. "But it's too cruel. After all, I didn't rescue him as a helpless kitten from the water. He was already about a month old. Regardless, he's now alive and well, and that's what matters," Irene smiled. They chatted a bit more, had another cup of coffee in the break room, and Fitch received a tasty sugar cookie. Then, Alejandro and his loyal friend bid farewell to Irene and left, confirming the date of the upcoming dinner for the following Friday. Irene stayed to finish her shift, and for the first time in many years, she felt that life wasn't an endless black streak. Once, she had been happy, loved, and now, all that remained was her job. A good job that she had always liked. From early childhood, Irene had dreamt of becoming a veterinarian, treating cats and dogs, parrots, and guinea pigs. And her dream had come true. She had come from a small village to a big city to study, aspiring to become a new Dr. Dolittle. She also dreamt of opening her own veterinary clinic one day and naming it not just anything but Dr. Dolittle. She studied well at the university and worked as an orderly in a real human hospital in the evenings. Overall, she saw all sorts of things, but it didn't deter her from her chosen profession. She always felt more sorry for animals than people. In the trauma hospital where she worked, young Irene soon met a male surgeon, a very attractive man almost twice her age. Passion engulfed the young student, and she dove into it with all the youthful enthusiasm and unwavering faith in her beloved. Initially, Senor Romero was very gentle and attentive, paid for her rented apartment. It was on his insistence that Irene moved there from the student dormitory. He bought her various expensive items, often visited her in the new cozy nest, and at work in the hospital, they would lock themselves in the dressing room to relieve stress between shifts. As a result, after a few months of such passionate relationship, Irene became pregnant. She still remembered the dialogue that took place between her and her beloved when she told him about her condition. A child? He didn't seem overly surprised by this fact, but he didn't show much joy either. Let me schedule an appointment for you with Reese next week. She will do everything that's needed. Everything that's needed? Irene didn't understand. Oh, how naive and silly she was back then. Well, yes, Eugene nodded. I'll talk to her tomorrow. Irene thought he meant a gynecological examination to make sure that everything was fine with her and the future baby. So, without any second thoughts, she came to the appropriate office a week later. Delgado? The sad elderly gynecologist was a true professional. Yes, Irene replied timidly. How far along are you? The woman asked while arranging some intimidating-looking instruments on the spotless sheet. About 4 weeks, I think. About? Do you keep a calendar? I don't have time, Irene blushed. I'm still studying. Everyone's a student, the gynecologist rudely told her. It's not for my good, be more careful in the future. Now, come on, get on the table. Do you want anesthesia or not? What do you mean? Irene still didn't understand what was happening. Oh, dear, the gynecologist rolled her eyes, without anesthesia, just like that. Anesthesia costs money too, but your admirer will pay for it, so it doesn't matter. Climb up. Why do I need anesthesia at all? Is it necessary for the examination? Did you come here for an examination? The gynecologist was amazed. Then, my dear, you got the wrong door. The women's consultation is downstairs. What's here, then? Feeling nauseous, Irene asked, barely able to breathe. This is pathology, the doctor snapped, and here, I deal with young fools like you. You mean, something began to dawn on Irene. Yeah. So, are we going to keep playing this game of misunderstanding, or will we finally get to it? No, you know, Irene mumbled, retreating to the door, you got it all wrong. Ah, I see. I usually understand everything correctly, but it seems you didn't quite get it when you decided to lie down under your bed guy. Well, Irene stammered, not finishing her sentence, and quickly left the room, slamming the door behind her. In the evening, she and Eugenio had a heated argument, most of which she didn't remember because of the stress. She only understood that she would be the giving birth to and raising the child alone. So, at just under 20, she became a single mother. Of course, it was very hard for her, terribly hard, studies, work, a newborn baby. She switched to correspondence courses at the university, got a part-time job at a clinic, and had to send her daughter to a private daycare when she was 3 months old. She remembered those days as a continuous sleepless marathon, night feedings, getting up every 2 to 3 hours to attend to the baby, waking up at 6 a.m., dressing, stroller, baby formula, daycare, work at the clinic until 3 p.m., picking up the baby from daycare, doing something at home, feeding, taking care of the baby, starting another part-time shift at 8 p.m., leaving the child alone at home in a diaper in a closed crib with tall bars, feeding at 12. She doesn't even remember how she fell asleep. She endured this for 6 months, and then the prepaid rent ended, and the parting gift from the handsome surgeon was eviction. She couldn't stay in a student dormitory with a child. Irene had to take an academic leave and go back to her parents' home. There, of course, there was a storm of indignation, but gradually, everything calmed down. Her mother, who unexpectedly became a grandmother, grew attached to her granddaughter, and her father also thawed. Leaving little Victoria with her parents, Irene returned to university. She worked again, but this time in a different clinic, studied, passed exams, and visited her daughter and parents a couple of times a year during vacations. On her final year, she met a good, decent man, a widower with a little son. They met in the hospital. Where else? She didn't have much free time, not even enough to go for a walk on the street. They didn't really have proper dates. There was no time for that. Still, they saw each other occasionally. But these brief meetings were enough for them to realize that they loved each other. Isidro, that was her new man's name, proposed to her after just a few weeks, and Irene agreed. They didn't arrange a lavish wedding. There was no need for it. They had a simple ceremony without guests and festivities. They started living in Isidro's apartment. He earned well. He was an architect and had his own small but steadily growing construction and design firm. Irene took her daughter back, and they lived a few happy years as one big, harmonious family: dad, mom, and 2 children, his son and her daughter. They planned to raise both of them as their own. Isidro intended to adopt Victoria, and she was going to adopt little Luciano. However, they postponed the paperwork until more peaceful times. Irene was finishing her university studies, and there was too much to do at home. They were building a large country house. But one day, Isidro went on a business trip for his company and didn't return home the next day or even after a week. Irene started searching for him. She alerted all the authorities, but Isidro disappeared without a trace. They only found his car by the river with his belongings scattered around. According to the investigators, it might have had something to do with his business, and he must have crossed someone. To say that Irene was in shock would be an understatement. She simply didn't want to live, couldn't breathe. She sent her children to her mother, locked herself in the apartment, and just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for her own death. Her mother saved her, worried that her daughter wasn't answering calls. Irene hadn't eaten or drunk anything for several days and didn't react to anything. She was placed in a social center sanatorium where they helped people in such situations. There, she gradually regained her composure. This is who we should learn from, Irene thought, taking care of the unfortunate dogs and cats at the veterinary clinic. Learn the joy of life, the joy of one's existence. While we are alive, we can share the one thing that no one can take away from us: ourselves. Even the most insignificant, destitute being can share their love with another creature. That's the meaning of life in self-sacrifice. Such thoughts made Irene feel better. The bitterness and disappointment from losing her loved one gradually turned into joy at the opportunity to give herself to someone, to share her warmth, care, and life. She returned, reintegrated into society, and got a job as a veterinary intern at the clinic. After some time, having confirmed her qualifications, she began practicing independently. Victoria, her daughter, and Luciano, Isidro's son, lived with their grandmother, Irene's mother, and Irene herself would visit them on weekends. She intended to adopt Luciano because besides her, he had no one left. On Friday, towards the end of her work shift, Alejandro and Fitch arrived, dressed nicely and in a cheerful mood. They brought her a funny cactus in a pot with arms sticking out in different directions, resembling a cute little gnome. The 3 of them got into the minivan and headed to a restaurant where a table had already been reserved. There, they had a wonderful, very joyful, and positive evening, sampling dishes from the menu and laughing at Fitch, who sat on the couch next to them, looking puzzled and whining as if to ask, "What's all this? I know I'm not supposed to eat from plates." With his head comically turning from side to side, he looked at his owner with confusion. After a few minutes, Alejandro, feeling sorry for his friend, placed Fitch's treat on the floor, and the dog calmly enjoyed various delicacies. Then, with permission from the people, he went to introduce himself to anyone who was ready. He sniffed a little poodle, who was celebrating his older human brother's birthday, glanced at 2 Siamese cats sitting in a large glass cage, pretending that everything around them didn't concern them in the slightest. and listened in bewilderment to the mocking remarks of a large gray parrot, a local veteran, who informed Fitch that Zazu, the parrot, shouldn't be touched, and Zazu was in charge here. This was a bit too much for the sensitive dog, so he decided it was best to return to his owner. Comfortably nestled under the table, Fitch rested his snout on Alejandro's leg and let out a satisfied sigh. They returned home closer to nightfall because after dinner, they took a walk along the riverbank. Alejandro remembered that it was around this time that he had found little Fitch, struggling with the last of his puppy strength in the icy water. Together with Irene, they reached that same spot, stood there for a while at the last span of the old bridge, looked at the water, already covered with thin ice. Winter had arrived early that year, and then they started their way back. From that day on, they began to see each other more frequently, going for walks together. Alejandro and Irene went to the movies, art exhibitions, and occasionally out for dinner. They also visited the shelter where Irene had finally healed from her tragedy. They volunteered, brought food for the animals, and walked some of the more sociable dogs. Fitch, who usually jealously guarded his owner from other dogs, didn't object to this pastime. It was as if he understood that these less fortunate dogs needed their support. Gradually, Irene and Alejandro became very close. They shared their own sad life stories with each other. Alejandro helped Irene a lot, especially since she didn't have her own car, and a couple of times, they even went together to the city cemetery to visit the graves of their loved ones. Then Alejandro got to know Luciano and Victoria, and they spent weekends at Irene's mother's house in the countryside. Fitch didn't leave the children's side and played with them all day long. The kids were very happy, and they considered these times as special occasions. Alejandro felt that with Irene, it wasn't just friendship, but about becoming something more to each other than just friends. There wasn't even any talk of it. They carefully observed their personal and visible boundaries, mutually respecting the fragile trust that had developed between them. Apparently, the time had not yet come for them to experience their resilience anew, to connect themselves with invisible threads to a new person. 3 months passed. Everything seemed fine both at work and in their personal lives, but one day, Alejandro felt like he was getting sick. His head hurt, his whole body ached, his eyes felt heavy as if filled with lead, and breathing was very difficult. By evening, his arsenal of home remedies was exhausted, and his temperature had risen significantly. His subordinates became worried and informed Don Marquez about their boss's condition. They called a doctor, who, informed of the patient's symptoms, brought an express test for the new cunning virus. The result turned out to be positive, and the oxygen content in the blood was also insufficient. The patient needed to be hospitalized urgently. Half an hour later, an ambulance was already taking the patient to the city's infectious diseases hospital. Don Marquez made a couple of phone calls, and Alejandro was placed in a separate improved ward on the first floor of the department, next to the round-the-clock duty station. Of course, they brought all the best medicines and necessary drugs. However, the next day, the patient's condition worsened. His blood oxygen levels dropped even lower, the test results were discouraging, and the doctor's prognosis was also not favorable. Alejandro was connected to an ALV, and even in a semi-conscious state, he did not forget to call Irene and warn her that their planned meeting was postponed. She became worried, called the hospital, inquired about the patient's condition from the doctors, and then came to talk to the attending physician. However, she was not allowed into the ward. The risk of infection was too great. Faithful dog Fitch had not been himself since the day his owner was taken away in a big car with sirens. He refused to work, did not patrol the territory as usual, did not play with Belle, and hardly ate anything. He lay near their house with his owner on the porch, resting his head on his paws and waiting. At night, the security guards let him inside, but they didn't lock the door. Early in the morning, Fitch went out, pressing the door handle with his paw, quickly completed his daily routine, and then lay down on the porch again. Sometimes he approached the gates, stood on his hind legs, pushed his snout between the fence bars, whimpering loudly, sniffing the air, and looking in the direction where Alejandro had been taken. Poor thing, he's upset, people pitied him. It's all right, it's all right. Your owner will get better soon and come back." But Alejandro was not getting better, despite all the efforts of the doctors. With each passing day, he felt worse. Most of the time, he slept under the influence of medications, or he was in a confused semi-conscious state, not knowing what year or day it was today. About a week or so later, he seemed to be getting a little better. He even called Irene and asked her to bring Fitch so that the dog, who had been suffering all this time, could calm down a bit and see him, even if only through the window. Irene did just that, came and brought Fitch with her. Don Marquez called the chief physician and explained the situation, asking them to let them inside the hospital courtyard. Fitch, finding himself on the unpleasant side of the fence, where, as he unmistakably felt, his precious owner was, pulled on the leash to the max and dragged Irene straight to the window of Alejandro's ward. Rising on his hind legs and pressing his wet black nose against the glass, he examined the interior, where on a white bed, entwined with colorful ropes, lay his dear friend half reclined. Irene made a phone call, and Alejandro, with his weak hand free from the tubing system, waved to Boy through the window. The dog saw his owner's lips move, calling his name. He couldn't make out the words, but having long learned to guess what the owner was saying by his lips, facial expressions, and gestures, he understood that Alejandro had called him a good boy and ordered him to wait. Well, an order is an order, and the smart dog obeyed, allowing them to take him back, even though he really wanted to stay right here under the window, just in case his owner needed him. Irene took him home, and there, for the first time in many days of Alejandro's absence, he even agreed to eat. From that day on, the entire life of the smart dog was filled with anticipation of his owner's return. Fitch saw that his friend was alive. He understood that he couldn't come to him right now. But he ordered him to wait, so Fitch knew how to wait, and now he was doing just that, waiting. He even started patrolling the territory several times a day, as he always did with his owner. But a few days later, in the dead of night, he felt so melancholic, so heavy-hearted, that he raised his smart muzzle to the heavens and saw a big glowing ball up there. For some reason, this yellow ball evoked such a poignant feeling of pity for himself that Fitch, unable to bear it, howled plaintively. At that very hour, Alejandro's condition deteriorated sharply. On the monitor screen in his ward, some symbols flashed, uneven lines with a blinking, descended, something piercingly howled, and a red light on the console indicated trouble. A bunch of people in white and blue robes rushed in, urgently brought in a large apparatus with thick wires, and, applying the large metal sensors to Alejandro's chest several times, sent a strong electric current through him. Then they inserted a tube into his throat, and he was left lying there, motionless, unaware of where he was or who he was. Don Marquez, good morning, sorry for calling so early. Yes, I'm calling about your employee, Gutierrez. Last night, his condition worsened, he was resuscitated, and now it's stabilized, but the chances are slim if we're being honest. Unconscious, yes, in an induced coma, the so-called cytokine storm. Of course, we will keep you informed. He doesn't have any close relatives, as far as I understand. Yes, of course. All the best, the doctor sighed and hung up. Early in the morning, after taking a walk to Alejandro's house, the guards did not find Fitch there. He went on patrol, one of them chuckled and winked at his partner. Of course, work is work, agreed that and playfully poked a comrade in the side, saying, don't you relax either. Happy with each other, they went back to the gates, reasoning that the dog, who had been circling the perimeter, would come for food himself. However, he didn't appear for breakfast or lunch. In the evening, the worried guards went to the guardhouse again but couldn't find the dog. The next morning, he still hadn't appeared, and they had to tell the owner about everything. However, he wasn't surprised or upset, he only scolded his security for the untimely report. Meanwhile, loyal Fitch had spent the last 2 days not just anywhere but in his beloved owner's hospital room, under the bed. Here's what happened. After howling at the indifferent moon to his heart's content, the dog felt that it wasn't enough to vent all the pain and anxiety growing inside him. So, without much thought, he soared over the fence like a furry arrow and dashed straight into the city, heading in the direction where he now knew his owner was. Even though Alejandro and Irene had taken the bus to the hospital, Boyd determined his own route unerringly. In an hour and a half, with rapid wolf-like strides covering many kilometers, skillfully navigating the right turns of the country roads, and dealing with the chaotic urban traffic, he was already near the clinic. He couldn't slip through the main entrance, guards shooed him away twice. Somehow, Fitch understood that it was better if his sneak remained a secret. After surveying the fenced territory from all sides, he found a weak spot beneath a high concrete fence. Jumping over it would hardly go unnoticed, and everywhere he looked, there were menacing glass eyes watching him from above, occasionally blinking with alarming red light. Later, it was precisely from the cameras that they managed to determine how the dog, in a matter of minutes, dug a narrow gap under the fence, entered the territory, made several leaps to reach the desired window, and momentarily stopped in front of the glass barrier. He stood on his hind legs, examining what was happening inside, then shook his head and flattened his ears, resolutely rushing straight at this always incomprehensible obstacle that bewildered animals, and with a clang and a crash, broke the glass, thus entering the room. Of course, he cut himself on the shards. Blood was found on the floor, scattered among the broken glass. People rushed in response to the noise and sirens, shouting, pacing back and forth, slamming doors, and making calls to various authorities. They covered the broken window with temporary film and repeatedly checked the life support device readings of the patient. Fitch sat quietly under the bed all this time. When they finally understood what was happening and tried to pull him out from there, he growled menacingly and snapped a brush in half, which some foolish person had put under the owner's bed. Finally, the head, apparently their leader, arrived. When he appeared, all the others fell silent and stopped running and shouting. "What do we have here?" he asked, scanning the room with his serious, attentive eyes. "A dog, Senor Pena," his subordinates reported, broke the window, jumped inside, and is sitting under the bed. The doctor dismissively waved away the message as if it were unimportant and unsurprising, just a stray dog breaking a window and getting into the intensive care unit. "I'm asking about this," he pointed his finger at the thin zigzag line displayed on the monitor at the head of the patient's bed, where disproportionately high, icicle-shaped peaks appeared. "This?" Other staff members gathered around the monitor. "It looks like brain activity." "So, you mean that for the first time in several days, when our patient is in critical condition, brain activity is recorded? And you guys are here dealing with catching a dog sitting under the bed?" The head clarified, and his voice took on metallic notes, not promising anything good for the employees. One of them began, but Senor Pena didn't let him finish. "Go get the emergency resuscitation kit," he shouted menacingly. Everyone, except the duty nurse, was swept away as if by the wind. "It's him," she pointed under the bed, smiling softly. "He did it." Then there was noise again, doors slamming, heavy electrodes were taken out, and they once again started applying them to Alejandro's bare chest. He himself was in a beautiful and very calm place. Here, there was no noise except for the gentle rustling of trees and birdsong. There were no irritating, demanding voices, no cries, moans, car horns, or the beeping of instruments and endless sirens. There was no bright, sharp light blinding the eyes or the alarming, blinking red lights either. Warm and even yellow light spread from somewhere to the side and above, giving peace and hope. He stood between the tree trunks on soft moss with bare feet, and his feet sank into it up to his ankles, like in a fluffy carpet. It was very pleasant. After standing like this for a while with his head thrown back, feeling the warm yellow light caressing his tired eyes, he seemed to wake up, looked around with refreshed eyes, and walked forward, towards the meadow visible between the trees. Emerging onto the boundless expanse, he was truly on a summer flowering meadow, and a few seconds later, a bicycle appeared on the winding dirt path, with his wife and their little daughter riding on it. "Natalia!" He shouted with all his might and ran towards her. In response, they waved to him and cheerfully shouted something. He was getting closer, closer. Just a bit closer. "No, Alex," Natalia sighed regretfully, "you can't come to us yet. It's too soon, remember that." I remember, of course, I remember, Alejandro replied sadly, lowering his gaze. Is Fitch with you now? Natalia said with a smile. He's such a good boy, isn't he? Yes, he is. He's my friend. But how do you know him? He appeared after. Alejandro looked at his wife in surprise. Goodbye, Alex. Goodbye, Natalia smiled, hugged their daughter, and rode off on her bicycle along the path. Fitch will definitely help you, he promised us. He's your angel. Wait for me, I'm coming with you. Alejandro stood there, bewildered, unable to move. It's still too early for you to come to us, Alex, Natalia's voice echoed in the air. It's still very early, so be happy. Alex, someone close and gentle softly said and gently took his hand. The colored spots trembling before his eyes gradually took on more or less clear shapes, and he saw that he was lying in a hospital bed in the intensive care unit, and Irene was sitting in a chair next to him, smiling at him, and not just her alone. Fitch, the good, wonderful, shaggy boy, was here too. He placed his gray, intelligent head on the edge of the bed and licked his owner's hand, murmuring something softly. Irene, Alejandro whispered with great effort, his tongue barely moving, marry me. Yes, she replied softly, squeezing his hand with her small palm. Yes, I agree. They got married a week after Alejandro was discharged. Boy passed away at the end of March on his owner's birthday. Irene, an experienced veterinarian, could never determine what had happened to him. But Alejandro knew exactly what had occurred, though he never told anyone, not even Irene. All night, as the dog slowly faded away, barely breathing, he sat next to him. Just before the end, he leaned in close to his beloved friend and whispered in his ear so that no one else could hear. Send my regards to Natalia and our daughter, Fitch. Take care of them, and don't be sad, because we will definitely see you again. In the clinic where Alejandro had been treated, nearly dying and coming back to life, he became a hospital legend, thanks to the story of a dying patient and his loyal dog. A month after Alejandro and Irene's wedding, Snow White Belle gave birth to 5 healthy puppies. One persistent little fellow stood out, plush as a teddy bear, light gray with a stripe along his back, a dark muzzle, and ears. And, of course, they named him Fitch in honor of his heroic and beloved dad.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.